Peace community, welcome to SelfCare series. We are a social justice infused wellness community intervention project. And in this video, we're going to be discussing self-care after imposter syndrome. So, imposter syndrome, loosely defined, is doubting your abilities and feelings like a fraud. It disproportionately affects high-achieving people who find it difficult to accept their accomplishments. I also want to put a social justice context on this. So, imposter syndrome disproportionately affects Black, Indigenous, and folks of color because we live in a society, a white dominant society, although they are the minority, that have perpetuated their cultural belief that Black, Indigenous, and folks of color have not contributed anything to the gains of society, and that is untrue. However, inundated with such messaging, we begin to internalize it. And so it becomes hard for us to acknowledge the greatness that exudes from us. So I would say imposter syndrome in the culture context in which I'm referring to it as is a byproduct of anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, faux white supremacist society. Faux meaning the concept of white supremacy is not real. It is fake, like that faux fur, you know? So with that said, I was considering what does it mean to heal after living your life believing that you are not enough, right? How does that impact those of us who are disproportionately told through media, through the educational system, through any institutions that reinforce white culture ideology, um, that we're not good enough, which also allows those who are incompetent, um, who lack skill in any particular area, who are uninformed, to take up space confidently as if they are competent, as if they are informed, um, as if they are an expert in their field. So for us, I was thinking and centering me, right? Which how healing works. Like, if does this work for me? So when I consider healing from imposter syndrome, I think about the narratives that I have internalized and the narratives that I thus tell myself. And so I have to counter those narratives. Um, Oftentimes start by placing my hand over my heart so my inner self knows that I'm talking directly to her. And I'll say that I am enough. I breathe that in, thinking of how that sentence alone is impacting me. And as I exhale, I think about exhaling any doubt out. Um, so I'm enough. That also includes I am affirmation statements, and I will put a link to some of my favorite I am affirmation videos that are culturally sound. Um, when I think of imposter syndrome, I also, or a way to combat imposter syndrome, I read, y'all. I remind myself of all the things that my people have contributed. Black inventors, language, math, science, institutions of higher learning, all those were founded in Africa. So it's like, I got some connection to this great stuff that the world um, is influenced by, that the world relies on to inform their forward movement, right? Also recognize how the little girl in me can be fearful and intimidated, right? And I think of how that influences my ability to show up fully and show up confidently. And so my biggest goal, like mentioned before, is shifting my self-talk, shifting that inner narrative. And I suggest that all Black, Indigenous folks of color who are watching this video begin to adopt the same conscious shift. That also includes, I would read the book of Proverbs. I would read African Proverbs, because a lot of our teachings, if we use the Sankofa approach, which is go back and find what works and use it, right? The wind is so strong. All right, so when thinking about using the Sankofa approach, which is to go back and fetch, go back and find. A lot of the answers in preserving our culture, preserving our sense of self-worth, preserving our humanity is built into our culture norms because we come from ancient societies that were so deep, so profound, right? So we don't really have to create new things. We just have to return home, as I like to call it. We just need to reground, right? Um, and so as a way to, I would say, buffer moments of imposter syndrome, I read, y'all. We got to remind ourselves of who we are and what our people have contributed. Whoever you are, right? Whoever the people you come from, I assure you that you have a great heritage as well. It's not only limited to those of us with direct African descent, right? Um, yeah, self-care after imposter syndrome, recognizing that imposter syndrome is a byproduct of institutional and cultural racism that spreads the belief um, that Black, Indigenous, and folks of color are not enough. And oftentimes, those who are in leadership positions who are white-bodied or white passing um, have stolen, right, the work of Black, Indigenous, and folks of color because it's socially acceptable to plagiarize and do just that and reclaim it. Much like how our communities are being taken from us. In the States, we're Black folk are experiencing, it's called gentrification, but it's really just modern colonialism, and it um, is associated with the pattern of white people's tendency to move into a place, take over that place, displace the people, the inhabitants who are there, um, um, rename that place, and remove any remnants of other people ever existing. Right? That's what they did to the indigenous people of America, also known as Turtle Island. That's what they did to the indigenous people of Australia. That's what they attempted to do to indigenous people of South Africa. So this is a long-standing pattern. Um, so just like knowing the context in which we exist can also serve as a form of self-care. And I want to be clear that as Black and Indigenous folk, those of us who are direct targets of conspiracies to destroy us, um, that self-care looks like being conscious of the realities that we exist in so we can better prepare ourselves for the necessary buffers, for the necessary preservation that is required to sustain us in our communities. Because we also know that colonizers, settlers, white society have a long-standing history of annihilating people. There are groups of people who simply no longer exist because they came in contact with colonizers who had the intention of destroying them to take um, their land or their goods, all that stuff. You know, it's a part of our human history. And if we do not contextualize it appropriately, then we miss out on our role in this society. Um, so yes, I hope that was helpful. I hope you're able to grab some gems. I will link some language on how one can go through the process of healing, of caring for oneself after acknowledging that they have internalized the belief that they are not enough when you are. I also want to briefly share my testimony of how imposter syndrome has shown up in my life as an educated, qualified Black woman. And it wasn't clear to me until the Derek Jackson video came out. So I created the Self Care After series as a community project back in 2016 when I began to um, a shift from direct action community organizing with the direct action community organizing group called Black Youth Project 100. And so my first project was called my first project was called Self-Care After a Fuckboy. And it views the casual mistreatment of women as a public health issue. So I measure the mental, emotional, and physiological impact that a culture of casually mistreating women has on the members of our community and the ripple effect it has on shaping our culture and how we engage with one another. I have a science background. I'm a researcher. I'm a healer, right? So I'm solution oriented to my approaches regarding any social injustices. And so, boom, in doing, knowing that this was research led and I just like, me just talking shit, I began to reach out to people whose profiles was building, again, being just community centered and community focused and thinking about how we can shift a culture that is healthier and more sustainable for us, particularly as Black folk, because the fuck boy ideology, although I'm not saying other communities of women aren't dealing with like patriarchy and like and fuck shit, but the culture of fuckboydom seems to be perpetuated in Black spaces, and it's really abnormal to not value your women. Anyway, so I'm coming with all this background, right? All this research and expertise. And so I reached out to Derek Jackson. This is like, again, 2016. And he was basically on some, if you don't pay me X amount of dollars, then you can't talk to me, basically. Just to come, years later to find out that he was a fraud himself, but particularly a narcissist, right? A sociopath, which allowed him to not have imposter syndrome, which allowed him to get on his video camera, sit in his car, and talk his shit and give what he was saying advice that was based on the double life he was living, but not based on like this hard hitting research with the goal really to heal our communities. You dig what I mean? And so after seeing that a few weeks ago, a couple of months ago, because I'm like, so much has happened in 2021 already. I think that was just March. I was like, dang, Diane, you've been doing this work, and I've done workshops in New York, in Denver, in Colorado, and Atlanta, Georgia. I do this work. I'm community centered, and I've helped in paradigm shifts happen to women who have been victims of this mistreatment, and just like culturally contextualize how this shit is impacting our communities, right? And yet I have been fearful in getting on camera and sharing what I know. Um, and part of that fear is just think like when you speak truth to power, you're attacked, right? If you haven't been able to cultivate a community that's willing to like fend for you, you do what I mean? And it's really difficult for Black women to cultivate that um, when we're not reinforcing the status quo that suggests that our value is based on our bodies and how we physically show up. You do what I mean? And so that's my testimony, and that's why I'm here today, or here in this video, to personally just challenge myself to show up, to share what I know, because communal knowledge is valuable. And again, in this society that is white led, it will convince us that it's not. But sit at the feet of the elders, recognize greatness when you are in the room with it, and learn from others. So I'm here. I'm an educator. I'm a teacher. I have my substitute teaching license. Um, I have the tools, and so I'm proud of myself. That's another thing. When healing after imposter syndrome, when any type of healing, you become proud of yourself for getting through it and doing just that. So I'm proud of myself for the care, the self-care that I've implemented to heal from imposter syndrome and to show up fully and hope that my message resonates, but more so empowers a community that I seek to empower. My shirt, Holistically Hood, I got it from a company called Be Light Filled. Be filled with light. Be light filled. I will link them on below. Like, subscribe, turn that notification on, because we are ran by algorithms, artificial intelligence. And if you do not like the video, it will say that you're not interested in this content. It will say that this content was to not fly, which we know that it was. And this is truly just the beginning. So thank you all for supporting the SelfCare series. Again, a community intervention project that infuses social justice education with wellness as a means to heal, restore, explore, and educate those of us of the African diaspora, those of us who are connected to indigenous communities and people of color across the global majority, as I like to call us. Peace and love. Thank you again. Bye.